The salt spray is cold over Pas-de-Calais in the pre-dawn hours of early June, 1944. On the French coast, men of the German 15th Army huddle behind concrete, steel-reinforced behemoths, their heavy artillery pieces aimed across the 21-mile stretch of water toward Dover. They stare into the darkness, waiting. They are the anvil, awaiting the hammer blow they know must come here, at the shortest point of the English Channel. This is the strategic center of gravity for the entire war in the West. It is the only logical place for the Allies to strike. And so they wait, scanning the horizon for the largest invasion fleet in human history, unaware that hundreds of miles down the coast, that fleet is already approaching the beaches of Normandy. This is the story of that cognitive paralysis. The anatomy of the greatest deception operation in military history, which hinged not on what the Allies did, but on what the German High Command already believed. It is the story of how Operation Fortitude succeeded not because it created a new reality, but because it confirmed a pre-existing and fatal assumption. This assumption was not born of fantasy. It was forged in the cold, hard logic of geography and logistics. To the German High Command, and especially to Adolf Hitler himself, Calais was the linchpin of Fortress Europe. The reasoning was simple and, on paper, irrefutable. A crossing at Pas-de-Calais was the shortest route. It offered the Allies the quickest path to the industrial heartland of Germany, the Ruhr Valley. It was the only port area capable of handling the immense tonnage of supplies an invasion would require. Furthermore, this section of the coast was the launch site for the V-1 flying bombs and the V-2 rockets, weapons Hitler fanatically believed could still turn the tide of the war. To lose Calais was to lose this terror weapon capability. Therefore, the Allies' must come to Calais. This belief was codified at the very highest level. On November 3, 1943, Hitler issued Führer Directive 51, a document that would become the foundational text for the German strategic failure in 1944. The directive stated, "The threat from the West has taken on menacing proportions. Should the enemy succeed in breaching our defenses on a broad front, the consequences within the foreseeable future would be unpredictable. I have therefore decided to strengthen the defenses in the West, particularly at those points from which we shall launch our long-range attacks on England." The directive was clear. The long-range attacks meant Calais. While the directive also mentioned Normandy, it explicitly identified the area targeted by FUSAG as the Times Schwerpunkt *, the decisive point. Hitler had committed his strategic mind to Calais months before the first rubber tank was ever inflated. This conviction was shared by the most senior military commander in the West, General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt. Von Rundstedt, the cagey, aristocratic commander-in-chief West, was a man of the old school. He looked at the map and saw what any trained Prussian officer would see. The Allies would take the path of least resistance and greatest reward. Normandy, with its exposed beaches and lack of deep-water ports, was a logistical nightmare. Calais was a dagger pointed at Germany's throat. In his post-war interrogations, von Rundstedt was clear about his assessment: the shortest sea crossing, the best port facilities, and the V-1 and V-2 sites. All this pointed to the Pas-de-Calais area. An invasion elsewhere, he concluded, would be a diversion. This single word, diversion, would echo in the halls of OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, for weeks after June 6, paralyzing any decisive response. The physical evidence of this belief was poured from concrete and forged in steel. The industrial hammer of the Atlantic Wall fell heaviest on Pas-de-Calais. While Normandy's defenses were certainly present, they were a fraction of the fortifications guarding the 15th Army's sector. The Calais area bristled with massive coastal batteries, true land battleships. Battery Tot, with its 4 380mm guns, could hurl a nearly 1-ton shell over 30 miles, easily reaching the English coast. Battery Lindemann housed 3 406mm cannons, monsters originally intended for battleships. These were surrounded by a dense web of interlocking strongpoints, minefields, and anti-tank divisions. By contrast, the defenses at Omaha or Utah Beach while deadly, were primarily medium-caliber casemates and infantry strongpoints. The sheer tonnage of concrete and steel invested in Calais was a sunk cost, both literally and metaphorically. Germany had bet its entire western defense on a geographic assumption, building a fortress so strong that the Allies simply decided to go elsewhere. This was the conundrum. The German 15th Army, arguably the most powerful concentration of forces in the West, was defending the wrong place. But they, their commanders, and their Führer, in early June 1944, on the French coast, men of the German 15th Army huddle behind concrete steel-reinforced behemoths, their heavy artillery pieces aimed across the 21-mile stretch of water toward Dover. They stare into the darkness, waiting. They are the anvil, awaiting the hammer blow they know must come here, at the shortest point of the English Channel. This is the strategic center of gravity for the entire war in the West. It is the only logical place for the Allies to strike. And so they wait, scanning the horizon for the largest invasion fleet in human history, unaware that hundreds of miles down the coast, that fleet is already approaching the beaches of Normandy. This is the story of that cognitive paralysis. The anatomy of the greatest deception operation in military history, which hinged not on what the Allies did, but on what the German High Command already believed. It is the story of how Operation Fortitude succeeded, not because it created a new reality, but because it confirmed a pre-existing and fatal assumption. This assumption was not born of fantasy. It was forged in the cold, hard logic of geography and logistics. To the German High Command, and especially to Adolf Hitler himself, Calais was the linchpin of Fortress Europe. The reasoning was simple, and on paper, irrefutable. A crossing at Pas-de-Calais was the shortest route. It offered the Allies the quickest path to the industrial heartland of Germany, the Ruhr Valley. It was the only port area capable of handling the immense tonnage of supplies an invasion would require. Furthermore, this section of the coast was the launch site for the V-1 flying bombs and the V-2 rockets, weapons Hitler fanatically believed could still turn the tide of the war. To lose Calais was to lose this terror weapon capability. Therefore, the Allies' times must come to Calais. This belief was codified at the very highest level. On November 3, 1943, Hitler issued Führer Directive 51, a document that would become the foundational text for the German strategic failure in 1944. The directive stated, "The threat from the West has taken on menacing proportions. Should the enemy succeed in breaching our defenses on a broad front, the consequences within the foreseeable future would be unpredictable. I have therefore decided to strengthen the defenses in the West, particularly at those points from which we shall launch our long-range attacks on England." The directive was clear. The long-range attacks meant Calais. While the directive also mentioned Normandy, it explicitly identified the area targeted by FUSAG as the Times Schwerpunkt asterisk, the decisive point. Hitler had committed his strategic mind to Calais months before the first rubber tank was ever inflated. This conviction was shared by the most senior military commander in the West, General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt. Von Rundstedt, the cagey, aristocratic commander-in-chief West, was a man of the old school. He looked at the map and saw what any trained Prussian officer would see. The Allies would take the path of least resistance and greatest reward. Normandy, with its exposed beaches and lack of deep-water ports, was a logistical nightmare. Calais was a dagger pointed at Germany's throat. In his post-war interrogations, von Rundstedt was clear about his assessment: the shortest sea crossing, the best port facilities, and the V-1 and V-2 sites. All this pointed to the Pas-de-Calais area. An invasion elsewhere, he concluded, would be a diversion. This single word, diversion, would echo in the halls of OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, for weeks after June 6, paralyzing any decisive response. The physical evidence of this belief was poured from concrete and forged in steel. The industrial hammer of the Atlantic Wall fell heaviest on Pas-de-Calais. While Normandy's defenses were certainly present, they were a fraction of the fortifications guarding the 15th Army sector. The Calais area bristled with massive coastal batteries, true land battleships. Battery Tot, with its four 380mm guns, could hurl a nearly 1-ton shell over 30 miles, easily reaching the English coast. Battery Lindemann housed 3 400 and 6mm cannons, monsters originally intended for battleships. These were surrounded by a dense web of interlocking strongpoints, minefields, and anti-tank divisions. By contrast, the defenses at Omaha or Utah Beach, while deadly, were primarily medium-caliber casemates and infantry strongpoints. The sheer tonnage of concrete and steel invested in Calais was a sunk cost, both literally and metaphorically. Germany had bet its entire western defense on a geographic assumption, building a fortress so strong that the Allies simply decided to go elsewhere. This was the conundrum. The German 15th Army, arguably the most powerful concentration of forces in the West, was defending the wrong place. But they, their commanders, and their Führer believed it was the only place. This conviction was the critical vulnerability, the psychological flaw in the armor of Fortress Europe. The Germans had done the Allies' work for them. They had identified the target, fortified it beyond all reason, and fixated their gaze upon it. All the Allies had to do was provide a ghost for the Germans to watch. This psychological preparation was the true battlefield, and it set the stage for the creation of Operation Bodyguard, the grand strategic deception that would protect the real invasion. The German fixation on Pas-de-Calais was a vulnerability, but a vulnerability is useless unless it can be exploited. The tool created for this exploitation was codenamed Operation Bodyguard. This was not a simple tactical ruse. It was the most complex and wide-ranging strategic deception plan in the history of warfare. Its objective was not merely to protect the D-Day landings, but to mislead the entire German High Command about Allied intentions on a global scale throughout 1944. Bodyguard was an umbrella operation, a symphony of lies composed of multiple, interlocking deceptions, designed to convince the Axis that Allied forces were stronger than they were, and that invasions were coming everywhere except the one place they were actually planned. It was a war fought not with bullets, but with phantom armies, false radio signals, and fabricated intelligence reports. The plan was formally blessed at the highest possible level. During the Tehran Conference in late November 1943, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met to finalize the grand strategy for the defeat of Nazi Germany. Alongside the firm commitment to Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, the Big Three approved the deceptive measures required to protect it. This strategic directive gave birth to Bodyguard, named, as Churchill noted, from a line of a Scottish prayer, "May God shield the King." Bodyguard to the King. In this case, Overlord was the King. The task of orchestrating this grand deception fell to the London Controlling Section, LCS, a secretive committee of brilliant, eccentric minds, led by Colonel John Bevan. The LCS was the playwright of the deception, drafting the master script that all Allied intelligence agencies would follow. The masterstroke of Bodyguard, the mechanism that made it truly effective, was the double-cross system, or XX committee. This system, run by MI5, was so audacious it bordered on the unbelievable. By 1943, British intelligence had successfully captured or turned every single Agent Germany had managed to insert into Great Britain. Not some, not most, but all of them. These captured agents were now controlled by British case officers, forming a secure, closed loop of communication directly to the Abwehr, German military intelligence. The Germans, believing these agents were their trusted assets, hungrily consumed the chicken feed, a mix of 90% verifiable, low-level truth, and 10% devastatingly false, high-level misinformation that MI5 fed them. The double-cross system was the pipeline, the delivery mechanism that allowed the LCS to inject its fabrications directly into the nervous system of the German High Command. Operation Bodyguard's sheer scale was industrial. It was not one plan, but a portfolio of deception. While Operation Fortitude, the focus of the FUSAG, was its centerpiece, it was supported by a global cast of phantom operations. Operation Zeppelin was designed to tie down German divisions in the Balkans, fabricating a massive and non-existent Allied threat from Egypt, and the eastern Mediterranean aimed at Greece and Bulgaria. Operation Vendetta supported this by faking a landing in the south of France, which would happen later, as Operation Dragoon. But the deception was timed to protect Overlord. In the north, Operation Sky, run from Scotland, created the fictional British Fourth Army. This army used false radio traffic and decoy equipment to convince Hitler that an invasion of Norway was imminent, successfully pinning down hundreds of thousands of German troops who could have been reinforcing France. This global web of lies required an industrial-level effort in information warfare. It consumed vast resources. Entire teams of radio operators spent their days broadcasting coded traffic for fictional divisions. Specialists built fleets of dummy landing craft and tanks. But the real factory floor was the XX Committee. This was where the raw material of the lie was processed. Case officers would spend weeks meticulously crafting a single report for a double agent, ensuring its tone, content, and timing perfectly aligned with the master script from the LCS. They cultivated the personalities of their agents, building trust with their German handlers in Berlin. The Germans in turn filed these reports, cross-referenced them, and invariably came to the conclusion the Allies wanted them to reach. The machine was working. Bodyguard was the grand strategy, the overarching narrative. The double-cross system was the engine that powered it, a perfectly sealed conduit into the mind of the enemy. But this machine, for all its brilliance, was still missing its most critical component. To sell the centerpiece of the lie, the idea that the main invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais, times after times a smaller diversion at Normandy, they needed more than just phantom radio signals. They needed a phantom army, and that army needed a real, believable, and fearsome commander. The Allies had the playbook and the engine. Now they needed their star performer, the one man whose name alone would validate the entire deception in Hitler's eyes. This set the stage for the creation of their most potent double agent, and the activation of their most famous general. Operation Bodyguard was a grand strategic framework, and the double-cross system was the engine to power it. But a play needs playwrights, and a performance needs a star actor. The architects of this grand deception were found in two forms: a secretive, high-level committee of strategic planners, and a single, wildly imaginative Spanish civilian. The committee was the London Controlling Section, or LCS. The civilian was Juan Pujol Garcia, known to MI5 as Agent Garbo. Together, they would write and perform the lie that saved D-Day. The London Controlling Section was, as its name implied, the central nervous system for all Allied strategic deception. Chartered in 1942, it operated from a basement office, its existence known only to the highest echelons of the War Cabinet. Its leader was Colonel John "Johnny" Bevan, a man who perfectly embodied the eccentric brilliance of British intelligence. A well-connected former stockbroker and a decorated veteran of the First World War, Bevan possessed, as one colleague noted, a mind that could see the unseen. He reported directly to the Chiefs of Staff and to Churchill himself. Bevan's job was not to invent tactics, but to draft the master narrative. His team was small and equally unorthodox. It included, for instance, the best-selling thriller novelist Dennis Wheatley. In his post-war memoir, The Deception Planners, Wheatley would recount how his imaginative suggestions for faking the D-Day landing site, once considered the realm of fiction, were adopted as formal military strategy. It was this team, in late 1943, that received the directive to create Bodyguard and began drafting the script for its most crucial component, the lie that the main invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais. The LCS had the what. They had the overarching story. But the double-cross committee, the operators of the captured agents, had a problem. They had many agents, but no single super agent with the access, the believability, and the network to single-handedly convince the German high command of a lie of this magnitude. And then, they found Juan Pujol Garcia. Pujol's story is one of the most bizarre in the annals of espionage. He was a Catalan civilian, a failed chicken farmer, who had managed to serve on both sides of the Spanish Civil War without firing a shot. That experience left him with a profound and equal hatred for both fascism and communism. He decided, as he put it, to make a contribution to the good of humanity by fighting the Nazis. He repeatedly offered his services to the British Embassy in Madrid, and they repeatedly and politely showed him the door, viewing him as a fantasist. Undeterred, Pujol did the next logical thing. He walked into the German embassy, presented himself as a fanatical pro-Nazi Spanish official, and offered to become a German spy. The Abwehr, desperate for assets in Britain, trained him, gave him a codebook and invisible ink, and sent him to London. Pujol, however, went only as far as Lisbon. From his new home in Portugal, he began his one-man war. Armed with nothing more than a blue guide to England, a map, and a few railway timetables, he began inventing a fictional reality. He fabricated reports from London, creating a network of imaginary sub-agents. He made mistakes that should have exposed him instantly, such as reporting that in Glasgow, men would do anything for a liter of wine, apparently unaware of Scottish drinking habits or the metric system. But his German handlers, equally ignorant, believed him completely. They were impressed. Back in Britain, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who were monitoring all Abwehr traffic, were horrified. They were picking up signals from a highly active German spy ring in England that MI5, which insisted it had captured all German agents, knew nothing about. A frantic hunt began for this master spy. It was only when MI5 cross-referenced the reports and realized the spy was fabricating information such as reporting on a convoy that didn't exist that they understood what was happening. This wasn't a German master spy. This was an Allied times potential times master spy. In April 1942, Pujol was finally smuggled into Britain and given the codename Garbo, because, as his new case officer noted, he was the best actor in the world. This case officer was Tomás Tommy Harris, a Spanish-speaking MI5 officer who perfectly complemented Garbo's energy. Together, they began the industrial-scale construction of Garbo's fictional world. This was the statistical hammer of the deception. By 1944, Garbo's network, which the Germans were funding at great expense, consisted of 27 entirely fictitious characters. Each had a name, a personality, and a role. There was a Venezuelan student in Glasgow, an indiscreet U.S. Army sergeant, a KLM pilot, and even a Welsh nationalist leading a fascist group called the Brothers of the Aryan World Order. To make the lies plausible, MI5 had to support this network. When one of Garbo's agents died, MI5 planted a fake obituary in the local paper. When another was arrested, his imaginary widow was granted an official government pension, all to new reality. They found a fatal assumption in the mind of the enemy, and confirmed it. Agent Garbo had a direct line to German intelligence, and the London controlling section had a script. Now, they needed to build the stage and hire the actors. The lie needed a physical form, a name, and a location. It was given the name First U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. This was the entity that would become known to history as the Ghost Army. Its designated assembly area was East Anglia and Kent, the corner of England directly opposite Pas-de-Calais. Its fictional order of battle was immense. A force of 11 phantom divisions, numbering over 150,000 men, all poised to strike at the very spot the German 15th Army was watching. The task of giving this phantom army a body fell to a unique and secretive American unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Activated in January 1944, this 1,100-man unit was a bizarre collection of artists, sound engineers, designers, and actors. Among its ranks were men who would later become famous, like the artist Ellsworth Kelly and the fashion designer Bill Blass. Their mission was tactical deception, and their tools were rubber, canvas, and electricity. This was the industrial-scale application of illusion. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, a core part of the 23rd, was tasked with the visual deception. They deployed an entire army of inflatable rubber decoys. By day, German reconnaissance planes flying at 30,000 feet would photograph what appeared to be vast motor pools of Sherman tanks, fields packed with 155mm long Tom artillery pieces, and depots full of trucks. In reality, they were just thin rubber shells, weighing 93 pounds each, that could be inflated in minutes and looked terrifyingly real from the air. Phony plywood landing craft were assembled and floated in the harbors of Dover and Folkestone. Dummy airfields were constructed, complete with fake P-51 Mustangs, to complete the picture of an army group preparing for amphibious assault. The visual lie was only the first layer. The 23rd knew that a modern army is also a massive source of electronic noise. This part of the deception was code-named Operation Quicksilver. The 3,103rd Signal Service Battalion was tasked with simulating the sound of FUSAG. They created a vast, complex web of phony radio traffic. From mobile radio trucks, they broadcast an endless stream of coded messages, simulating the chatter between a corps headquarters and its subordinate divisions, regiments, and battalions. They knew German listening posts were not just counting signals, but analyzing the fist of each operator, the unique rhythm of their Morse code. The 3,103rd meticulously simulated this, creating distinct electronic personalities for dozens of fictional radio operators, all reporting on troop movements, supply requisitions, and embarkation plans for the attack on Calais. To German radio intelligence, FUSAG sounded like a real, massive, and very busy army. Finally, there was the human element, the most surreal part of the deception. Soldiers from the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were, in effect, actors in the largest running play of the war. They would sew the fictional FUSAG shoulder patch onto their uniforms and visit the local pubs and villages in East Anglia. They would intentionally leak gossip to bartenders and shopkeepers, knowing that German agents, or at least informants, were listening. They would drive trucks in looping convoys, just to create the impression of massive logistical movements. In his post-war account, Captain Fred Fox of the 23rd described the unit's strange mission. It was not until 167 years later, after George Washington, that the U.S. Problix S-Lands ever U.S. Problix Army organized a unit especially trained and equipped for deception. This unit was called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Ellsworth Kelly, who served in the 603rd, later described the experience to an interviewer. "We were in Normandy, pretending to be a big, strong armored division which, in fact, was still in England. That way, even though the tanks were only inflated, the Germans would think there were a lot of them there. We just blew them up and put them in a field. It was, as he put it, make-believe. This make-believe was profoundly effective. FUSAG was now a complete multi-sensory illusion. It could be seen from the air, it could be heard by radio intercept, and its soldiers could be seen on the ground. The German intelligence apparatus was dutifully reporting every detail. Agent Garbo's fictional network was sending a steady stream of reports about this massive army in Kent, confirming what the German reconnaissance planes and radio intercepts were telling them. The trap was set, the stage was built, the props were in place, and the actors were in costume. All the illusion needed was a star, a single, believable commander, so feared by the Germans that his very presence would validate the entire Phantom Army. The Allies had just the man, a general currently in disgrace, waiting for a new command. The Ghost Army was a masterpiece of stagecraft. It had props, a location, and a sound department. But every great production needs a star, a leading man so convincing that his presence alone sells the entire illusion. For Operation Fortitude, that star was General George S. Patton, Jr. He was, without question, the one Allied general whom the German High Command both viscerally feared and professionally respected. To the German mind, Patton was the master of time's blitzkrieg asterisk, the American Guderian. They saw him as aggressive, unpredictable, and brilliant at armored warfare. The Allies knew this. And, thanks to Patton's own uncontrollable temper, they had the perfect opportunity to use him. In August 1943, during the otherwise triumphant Sicily campaign, Patton's career had imploded. On two separate occasions, August 3rd and August 10th, Patton visited evacuation hospitals. There, he encountered soldiers suffering not from visible wounds, but from what was then called battle fatigue. The first, Private Charles H. Cool, admitted he was nervous and just couldn't take it. The second, Private Paul G. Bennett, was shivering and crying, saying, "It's my nerves. I can't stand the shelling anymore." Patton, who viewed shell shock as pure cowardice, flew into a rage. He cursed the men, called them gutless bastards, and slapped them Cool with his gloves and Bennett with his bare hand, knocking the man's helmet liner off. The incidents were a political and military disaster. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower was informed, his fury was cold and absolute. In a blistering secret letter to Patton, Eisenhower wrote, "I am well aware of the fact that you have no excuse for your brutal treatment of sick soldiers. I am giving you this official letter of reprimand. I will, at least for the present, relieve you of your command. If there is a repetition of such inexcusable conduct, I shall summarily relieve you from duty." Patton was forced to apologize to the soldiers, to the hospital staff, and to entire divisions. His humiliation was total. In his diary, a despondent Patton wrote, "All my life I have been a soldier, and now I am in the discard. I see nothing ahead for me but oblivion." He genuinely believed his career was over. But to the deception planners in London, this disaster was a golden opportunity. Patton was now the most famous, most feared, and most times available times general in the Allied arsenal. He was a brawler, sidelined for bad behavior. The German High Command, which built its intelligence profiles around personalities, found this situation deeply illogical. They simply could not conceive that the Allies would bench their single best armored commander for the time's real-time invasion, especially over a trivial matter like slapping a soldier. Their logic was firm. If the Allies were serious about crossing the Channel, Patton would lead the charge. Therefore, whichever army Patton commanded, asterisk that times would be the times Schwerpunkt asterisk, the main point of attack. The Allies leaned into this assumption with full force. Patton was brought to England in early 1944, and with great public fanfare, given command of FUSAG. He was photographed visiting troops, ghost army actors in FUSAG patches, reviewing his armored divisions, inflatable tanks, and dining in Kent. This news was meticulously fed by the XX committee straight into the German intelligence machine. Agent Garbo's network, the most trusted source in Britain, began sending a flood of reports. Garbo's agents reported on the massive buildup of FUSAG, and most critically, confirmed that its commander was the famous General Patton, who was openly boasting in London that he would lead the charge into Calais. The bait was taken, hook, line, and sinker. German intelligence reports from the spring of 1944 show a complete fixation on Patton. Colonel Alexis von Roenne, the chief of Times Fremde Heer West Times, Foreign Armies West, the man responsible for analyzing Allied strength, was the deception's most important victim. Von Roenne, who was secretly anti-Nazi but professionally meticulous, received Garbo's reports and the radio intercepts of FUSAG. He saw the aerial photos of the dummy equipment, and he saw that Patton was in command. For him, this was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It all fit. He officially reported to the German High Command, OKW, that the primary invasion force was FUSAG, under Patton, and that it was targeting Pas-de-Calais. Any other landing, his reports concluded, would be a mere diversion. The trap was now fully set. The deception was a perfect, self-reinforcing loop. The Germans believed Calais was the logical target. The Allies built a phantom army, FUSAG, opposite Calais. The Allies gave this phantom army a real, terrifying sound via radio deception. They gave it a real, trusted messenger in Agent Garbo. And finally, they gave it a real, feared commander in General Patton. Every piece of intelligence the Germans collected from the air, over the radio, and from their most trusted spies told them the exact same simple and completely false story. All that was left was for the real invasion to begin. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the headquarters of General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, was a pit of confusion. The sprawling complex at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, outside Paris, was inundated with a blizzard of conflicting reports. First came the news of airborne landings, scattered and seemingly chaotic, near Caen and on the Cotentin Peninsula. Then, at dawn, the horrifying reports from the Normandy coast. A massive naval bombardment. And then, the landings. But to the German High Command, this chaos did not look like an invasion. It looked exactly like the large-scale diversion they had been told to expect. The real threat, they remained convinced, was 150 miles to the northeast, at Pas-de-Calais, where Patton's FUSAG was still waiting. This cognitive paralysis, this fatal adherence to the FUSAG lie, defined the German response for the first, critical 24 hours. At Hitler's headquarters at Berchtesgaden, the Führer was asleep, having taken a sleeping draft. His key adjutants, General Alfred Jodl and General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, received the news from Normandy with skepticism. They too were victims of fortitude. When von Rundstedt's chief of staff, General Gunther Blumentritt, called OKW to request the immediate release of the strategic panzer reserves, the 12th SS Panzer and Panzer Lehr, the only forces capable of driving the Allies back into the sea, he was met with a devastating refusal. Jodl and Keitel would not commit these divisions. They would certainly not wake the Führer for what was, in all likelihood, merely the opening feint. The real invasion at Calais would require these panzers. And so, as thousands of Allied troops consolidated their fragile beachheads, Hitler slept until noon. The deception's masterstroke, however, was yet to come. The entire plan now rested on convincing the Germans not times to move, even after the landings had begun. This was the moment for Agent Garbo. As Allied soldiers fought and died on Omaha Beach, Garbo and his handler, Thomas Harris, were composing their greatest performance. At 3 a.m. on June 6th, Garbo's German handler in Madrid had been told to stand by for an urgent message, but no one was at the radio post to receive it. Garbo, in a brilliant piece of theater, spent the morning sending frantic, angry messages berating the Abwehr for their negligence. When he finally made contact, he delivered his masterpiece. He reported that the Normandy landings were, just as he had warned, a diversionary attack. He apologized for his network missing the exact time. But crucially, he confirmed that his primary agents embedded within FUSAG reported that Patton's army group in Kent had not times moved. It was, he insisted, at full strength and preparing for the main assault on Pas-de-Calais. To the German High Command, this was the evidence they were waiting for. It confirmed their bias. The Normandy landing, however large, was a trap. This message, coming from their most trusted agent in Britain, was so convincing that on June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, Garbo sent an even more audacious, 2-hour-long radio message. He provided a complete, fictional order of battle for FUSAG, detailing 11 divisions under Patton, and stated they were moving to their embarkation points. The Germans believed it completely. On July 29, 1944, nearly 2 months after D-Day, the German High Command would award Juan Pujol Garcia the Iron Cross for his services to the Reich. The statistical hammer of this deception is staggering. On D-Day, the German 7th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Dahlmann, was responsible for defending Normandy. It was a holding force, comprised of largely static or lower-quality infantry divisions, many filled with older men or conscripts from occupied Eastern Europe. Facing them, the Allies landed over 150,000 men on the first day. Meanwhile, sitting idle in Pas-de-Calais, was the German 15th Army. This was the elite force. It contained 19 divisions, including powerful panzer formations, bristling with the best equipment and men the Wehrmacht had in the West. This entire army, the only force that could have decisively crushed the Normandy lodgment in its infancy, remained a spectator. The sun set on June 6, 1944, with the Allies holding a fragile but definite foothold in France. The deception had worked more perfectly than its architects had dared to dream. The most powerful German army in France had not moved. It stood guard, its binoculars trained on the empty shores of Kent, waiting for a ghost army, led by a phantom general, that would never, ever come. The lie had held for the most important 24 hours of the war. Now, the question was, how long could they keep it going? June 7th, 1944. The sun rose on a scene of carnage and chaos in Normandy. The Allied beachhead was a fragile ribbon of sand, barely a few miles deep. At Omaha, the Americans were still clinging on by their fingernails. At Caen, the British were stalled. This was the decisive window. The Allies were ashore, but they were not secure. They were desperately vulnerable to a concerted armored counterattack. The German High Command now faced the most important decision of the war in the West. Was this the invasion or the diversion? On the ground in France, the two most experienced German commanders were beginning to have a horrifying realization. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, the C in C West, and General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, were both men of the old school. They had been skeptical, but the sheer scale of the Normandy landings, the thousands of ships, the overwhelming air power was impossible to ignore. This was no feint. Rommel, who was in Germany for his wife's birthday when the invasion began, raced back to his headquarters. He and von Rundstedt began a frantic series of telephone calls to OKW, Hitler's high command. Their message was the same: this is the main attack. We must release the Panzer reserves from the 15th Army in Calais and hurl them at the beachhead times now asterisk, before the Allies can consolidate. Their pleas met a wall of ideological and psychological paralysis. At Berchtesgaden, Hitler was now awake, and he was furious. But he was also immovable. He, Jodl, and Keitel were the true believers, the high priests of the FUSAG deception. They were utterly convinced that Normandy was a trap. In his post-war interrogations, Jodl would recall the thinking: the Normandy landing was designed to do one thing: draw the 15th Army and the strategic Panzer reserves away from Pas-de-Calais, at which point Patton's times real-times army, FUSAG, would strike the decisive blow. To move those divisions would be to fall for the most obvious trick in the book. Therefore, Hitler's orders on June 7th and 8th were explicit and catastrophic. The 15th Army was forbidden to move. The powerful Panzer divisions stationed in the Calais sector were to remain in place. Instead of a massive, coordinated counterstroke, the German response in Normandy was piecemeal. Only the 21st Panzer Division, already nearby, and scattered elements of the Panzer Lehr and 12th SS were fed into the fight. They fought with fanaticism, but it was too little, too late. The German command structure, divided between Rommel, von Rundstedt, and Hitler's personal control of the Panzers, had seized up. This paralysis was not just a fortunate accident. It was being actively and brilliantly encouraged. As the battle raged in Normandy, the deception planners in England went into overdrive. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and the 3,103rd Signal Service Battalion redoubled their Quicksilver radio traffic. The phantom FUSAG, far from standing down, suddenly became more times active. Its radio signals simulated the final, frantic preparations for embarkation. Dummy landing craft were concentrated in the harbors of Kent. Agent Garbo, on June 9th, sent his 2-hour-long masterpiece, the message that confirmed to the Abwehr that the FUSAG assault was imminent, likely within days. This was the industrial hammer of the lie, applied times after times the battle had begun. Intercepted German communications confirmed its success. On June 10th, a full 4 days after D-Day, German intelligence sent a directive to 2 panzer divisions that had time-started times to move toward Normandy. The directive ordered them to turn around and return to Pas-de-Calais. The reason given: certain information, Garbo's reports, indicated an immediate threat to that sector. The 15th Army, the most powerful German force in France, was now not just a spectator, it was a prisoner of the Ghost Army. The critical 48-hour window, and then the 72-hour window, slammed shut. The Allies poured men and material onto the beaches. The mulberries, the artificial harbors, were being assembled. The foothold became a lodgment. The panzers that could have driven the invaders into the sea were held in reserve, waiting for Patton, until it was far too late. Von Rundstedt and Rommel could only watch in horror as the strategic failure, dictated from a bunker in Berchtesgaden by a Führer, obsessed with a phantom, became irreversible. The lie had not just protected the landing, it had guaranteed the beachhead. The first phase of the deception was over. Now, the Allies had to sell the lie for a second time. To protect the breakout. By late June 1944, the Normandy campaign had devolved into a meat grinder. The Allied breakout had failed, and the armies were now bogged down in a horrific war of attrition inside the Times Bocage asterisk. This ancient countryside, a maze of dense, centuries-old hedgerows, was perfect defensive terrain. The Germans, though outnumbered, were inflicting terrible casualties. The beaches were secure, but the war for France was being fought, and nearly lost, in a claustrophobic green hell. For the Allies, this stalemate was a crisis. For the German High Command, it was proof. It proved that the Normandy landing, which was now consuming all of their available reserves from the 7th Army, was a bloody diversion that was failing, just as they had predicted. The Times' real-times army, Patton's FUSAG, was still waiting to strike at Calais. The deception planners of the London controlling section now faced their greatest challenge. The lie had to be pivoted. FUSAG's mission was no longer to be the imminent invasion. Day had passed. Its new, and arguably more critical, mission was to become the second wave, the main Times event that was so large and so threatening that it would justify holding the 15th Army in place, starving the Normandy front of the very reinforcements that could have won them the battle. The lie had to be not just maintained, but expanded. The Ghost Army's radio operators, the 3,103rd Signal Service Battalion, began a new campaign. Their radio traffic now simulated the arrival of new phantom divisions from America and Britain, divisions that were swelling FUSAG's ranks. By early July, German intelligence maps, based on this radio traffic, showed FUSAG growing to over 20 divisions, a force far larger than the one currently bleeding to death in the hedgerows. This new lie was sold with masterful psychological precision by Agent Garbo. Throughout mid-June and early July, as the Normandy battle raged, Garbo's network fed a steady stream of high-level intelligence to the Abwehr. His reports were brilliant in their construction. He confirmed that General Patton was furious that the Normandy diversion was bogged down, as it was failing in its mission to draw off German reserves. However, Garbo's agents reported that Patton was also content to wait, as the Normandy stalemate was achieving the same effect. It was acting as a suction pump, pulling all available German panzer divisions into a battle of attrition, leaving Pas-de-Calais wide open for his real-times attack. This story was perfect. It explained the delay, it confirmed German strategic bias, and it gave them a powerful incentive to keep their best troops exactly where they were. The industrial and statistical hammer of this second lie is found in the German High Command's own order of battle maps from July 1944. These documents, captured after the war, show a picture of strategic insanity. 7 full weeks after D-Day, with the German 7th Army in Normandy being systematically annihilated and its commanders, Rommel and von Rundstedt, screaming for reinforcements, the OKW map still showed the 15th Army largely intact in Pas-de-Calais. This force of over 15 divisions, including critical Panzer and SS Panzer units, was still held in reserve, its primary mission to defend against Patton's ghosts. General Eisenhower would later write of this period with awe, stating, "The German 15th Army, which, if committed to battle in June or July, might possibly have defeated us by sheer weight of numbers, remained inoperative during the critical period of the campaign. The lie was holding, stronger than ever." The pivot from imminent invasion to delayed main event had been executed flawlessly. The Germans were now trapped in a psychological prison of their own making, reinforced by every radio signal and every spy report they received. They were fighting a two-front war in France, a real one against Montgomery and Bradley, and a phantom one against Patton. This paralysis, this withholding of the 15th Army, was the single most important factor in allowing the Allies to build up the overwhelming force they would need to finally break the Normandy stalemate. The deception was now resting on the shoulders of one man in German intelligence, an anti-Nazi patriot who, in a tragic irony, was FUSAG's most effective and unwitting accomplice. The entire edifice of Operation Fortitude, a construct of rubber, radio, and lies, was ultimately validated and sold to Adolf Hitler by one man. He was not a double agent, nor a fool. He was Oberst, Colonel Alexis Freiherr von Roenne, the aristocratic and highly respected chief of Times Fremde West Times, FHW, the German Army's intelligence branch for the Western Front. Von Roenne was the official gatekeeper, the man responsible for analyzing all incoming data from spies, radio intercepts, and aerial reconnaissance, and compiling the definitive report on Allied strength and intentions for the German High Command. He was, in effect, Hitler's favorite intelligence analyst, and he was the deception's single most important victim. Von Roenne was not a gullible Nazi fanatic. He was a professional intelligence officer, a devout Christian, and a man of the old Prussian school who had built a reputation for meticulous, sober analysis. His reports were the gold standard. When von Roenne signed his name to an assessment, the General Staff and OKW accepted it as fact. The deception planners in London, though they did not know him personally, understood that their entire plan hinged on convincing this one man. If he believed in FUSAG, Germany would believe. If he was skeptical, the entire lie would collapse, and the 15th Army would be unleashed on Normandy. The FHW reports, authored by von Roenne, in the spring and summer of 1944, are a testament to the total success of the Allied deception. The actual Allied force in Britain in early June 1944 consisted of approximately 45 divisions. However, von Roenne's official reports, which synthesized Garbo's fabrications, the Ghost Army's radio traffic, and the sightings of dummy equipment, painted a vastly different picture. An FHW report from early June, bearing von Roenne's approval, listed a staggering 89 times Allied divisions in the British Isles. This was an inflation of nearly 100%. The report went further, identifying the bulk of these phantom divisions, a force of over 20 divisions as belonging to FUSAG, which it correctly placed in Kent and Sussex. His assessment, sent directly to Hitler, was clear. The force employed in Normandy was a secondary one. The main strategic reserve, FUSAG, was larger, more powerful, and still waiting, under Patton, to strike at Pas-de-Calais. This assessment, which historians have called one of the greatest intelligence failures of the war, is what held the 15th Army in place. But it is here that the story enters a realm of profound and tragic mystery. Colonel Alexis von Roenne was leading a double life. He was not a Nazi. He was a secret anti-Hitler conspirator. His devout Christian faith was outraged by the SS atrocities in Poland and the genocide of the Jews. He was a friend to many of the men at the heart of the July 20th Valkyrie plot to assassinate Hitler, including Claus von Stauffenberg. This fact presents the ultimate dual conflict, an unanswerable question of history. Was von Roenne simply the deception's greatest dupe, a professional analyst who was completely and tragically fooled by Garbo's brilliance? Or, as some historians like Ben McIntyre have argued, did he intentionally mislead Hitler? Did he receive the FUSAG reports, suspect or even no they were fabrications, and deliberately validate them? Was he, in effect, an Allied collaborator, using his position to pass on the lie, knowing it would hamstring the German war machine and hasten the end of the regime he loathed? We will never know. Some of his peers reported that he was a victim of wishful thinking, his anti-Nazi bias making him want to believe the Allies were stronger than they were. But the outcome was the same. Whether he was a professional victim or a patriotic saboteur, von Roenne's stamp of approval on the FUSAG lie was the definitive act. He had used his unimpeachable reputation to sell Hitler the Phantom Army. This act would cost him his life. After the failed July 20th plot, the Gestapo dragnet swept up all suspected conspirators. Von Roenne was arrested on August 9th. Though not an active plotter, his knowledge of the conspiracy was enough. He was brought before the infamous People's Court. When the judge, Roland Freisler, demanded his motive, von Roenne simply declared that Nazi racial policies were incompatible with his Christian values. He was found guilty and, on October 12, 1944, he was taken to Plötzensee prison in Berlin and hanged from a meat hook. His validation of the lie had cost Germany the battle for France, and it had cost him his life. The success of Operation Fortitude cannot be measured simply by the brilliance of its agents or the realism of its props. Its true measure is industrial. A stark equation of steel withheld versus steel desperately needed. By mid-July 1944, the battle for Normandy was a slogging match of horrific attrition, defined by the claustrophobic hedgerows of the Times bocage asterisk. The Allied advance was stalled, and the front lines were consuming men, tanks, and ammunition at an unsustainable rate. The winner would not be the side with the best plan, but the side that could feed the most material into this grinder. The Allies were pouring in their vast industrial might. The German 7th Army was hemorrhaging, and 150 miles away, the German 15th Army, the most powerful strategic reserve in France, sat and waited for an enemy that did not exist. This was the statistical hammer of the lie. The 15th Army, under General Hans von Salmuth, was not a token garrison. It was a formidable fighting force of over 19 divisions, numbering well over 200,000 men. Even in mid-July, 7 weeks after D-Day, its core remained intact in Pas-de-Calais. This phantom horde included elite formations. The 116th Panzer Windhund, Greyhound Division, a powerful and fully equipped armored unit, was held there, uncommitted, until late July. Other high-quality infantry formations like the 344th, 348th, and 85th Infantry Divisions, which were desperately needed to create a reserve line in Normandy, were instead manning the coastal defenses of the Somme estuary, staring at the empty English Channel. The 1st SS Panzer Division, LSSAH, Hitler's personal bodyguard and one of the most powerful armored formations on Earth, was also kept near the 15th Army sector for weeks, before finally being fed piecemeal into the Normandy furnace, too late to have a decisive impact. This strategic misallocation must be contrasted with the reality of the Normandy front. The German 7th Army and Panzer Group West were, by mid-July, on the verge of annihilation. They had no reserves, they had no rest, and they had no air cover. The memoirs of the German commanders in Normandy are a litany of industrial desperation. Kurt Panzermeier, the commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division's Grenadiers, wrote in his memoir Times Grenadiers Times of the psychological and physical destruction wrought by the Allied fighter bombers, or Jabos. He wrote, "The Jabo terror was a continuous, morale-sapping plague. My men were being hunted, harried, and torn apart. Any movement by day was suicide. The Allies had achieved total air supremacy, turning the roads behind the German lines into a racetrack for P-47 seconds and typhoons. Supplies could not get in, and the wounded could not get out. The most damning piece of primary evidence comes from General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel himself. On July 15th, just 2 days before he was grievously wounded by a British Spitfire, Rommel sent his final, desperate report to Hitler. It was not a request. It was a death notice for the army. He stated, "The situation on the Normandy front is growing more difficult daily and is approaching a serious crisis. The troops are fighting heroically everywhere, but the battle is unequal. The enemy's air superiority has a crushing effect. Our own losses in men and materiel are extraordinarily high and replacement is negligible." He concluded with a chillingly blunt assessment. The front is crumbling. It is in the interest of the Reich that a line be drawn under the consequences of this. This was the dual conflict of the German position. The belief in FUSAG, validated by Colonel von Roenne, was the first half of the trap. The second, and equally industrial, half was the Allied transportation plan. In the months leading up to D-Day, Allied bombers had systematically destroyed the logistical network of northern France. By mid-July, every single bridge times over the Seine and Loire rivers between Paris and the sea, all 24 of them had been dropped into the water. This was the true industrial hammer. Even if Hitler, on July 16th, had finally seen through the FUSAG lie and ordered the 116th Panzer and the rest of the 15th Army to move to Normandy, it was logistically impossible. They were trapped. They could not cross the Seine. The belief in the Ghost Army had held the strategic reserve in place for exactly long enough for Allied air power to build a physical, impassable wall behind them. The lie had created a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the German 7th Army was now alone, about to be broken. On July 25th, 1944, 7 weeks after D-Day, the Normandy stalemate was about to be broken by an act of industrial-scale violence. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, had conceived a high-stakes gamble code named Operation Cobra. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. He would concentrate a terrifying amount of air power on a tiny 3-by-1-mile sector of the German line west of Saint-Lô, effectively vaporizing the entire defense. Through the smoking hole, he would pour his armored divisions and unleash a new army, held in reserve for this very moment. The stalemate was about to end, and the war of movement was about to begin, all because the German strategic reserve was still, at this late date, waiting for Patton in Calais. The industrial hammer of Cobra was not figurative, it was literal. At 10 a.m. on July 25th, the skies over the German lines darkened. In waves, a seemingly endless armada of over 2,400 Allied aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and hundreds of medium bombers and fighter bombers unloaded more than 4,100 tons of high explosives and fragmentation bombs on the German positions. The target of this carpet bombing was the unfortunate and elite Panzer Lehr Division. This division, already worn down by weeks of fighting, simply ceased to exist. General Lieutenant Fritz Behrlein, the division's commander and a veteran of Africa, was left in a state of shock. In a post-war interrogation, he described the scene as hell. He reported, "The planes kept coming overhead like a conveyor belt. My front lines looked like a landscape of the moon, and at least 70% of my personnel were out of action, dead, wounded, crazed, or numb. 3 entire battalion command posts were wiped out. Tanks were flipped upside down. The German defense on the Cobra front had been physically annihilated." Into this smoking, cratered lunar landscape, General J. Lawton Collins's 7th Corps attacked. The 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions advanced, finding only dazed survivors and pulverized trenches. The crust was broken. Now came the exploitation force. The 1st Infantry and 2nd Armored Divisions, punching deep into the German rear. And with this breach, the great phantom of FUSAG became a terrifying reality. On August 1st, 1944, General George S. Patton's Times Real Times U.S. Third Army was officially activated. Patton, the man who had been the star of the Phantom Army, was finally, mercifully, unleashed. His armored columns, led by the 4th and 6th Armored Divisions, poured through the hole created by Cobra, turned right at Avranches, and began a rampage that would become legend. Patton, ever the cavalryman, was in his element. He had told his staff his simple philosophy: hold them by the nose and kick them in the pants. Cobra had held the nose. Patton was now delivering the kick. This is the moment the true price of the FUSAG lie was paid. As Patton's Times Real Times Army drove south into Brittany and east toward Le Mans, the German High Command, in a state of panic, finally recognized the truth. Normandy Times was Times the main event. Hitler, in a fit of rage, finally released the 15th Army from Pas-de-Calais. The powerful 116th Panzer Division was ordered, on July 28th, to race to Normandy, but it was 7.5 weeks too late. The Seine bridges were gone. The unit was harassed every mile of its journey by Allied jabos. When it finally arrived at the front, it was not as a strategic reserve to hold a line, but as a fire brigade thrown into an unwinnable fight, a desperate attempt to plug an unstoppable flood. The breakout was complete. The lie had held the German strategic reserve in Pas-de-Calais for 50 critical days. It had held them there while the Allies endured the stalemate, built up their forces, and prepared the decisive blow. Now, the 7th Army was in full collapse, and the 15th Army was arriving just in time to be encircled with them in what would become the Falaise Pocket. The battle for Normandy, a battle of attrition that the Allies had been dangerously close to losing, was over. The lie had unraveled, and with it, the entire German position in France. The race across France, and the end of the 15th Army, had begun. The first days of August 1944 were the unraveling. The German front in Normandy had not just been breached by Operation Cobra, it had been shattered. General Patton's real-time's Third Army was now a torrent, pouring through the Avranches Gap, his armored columns fanning out. They drove west into Brittany to seize the U-boat pens, but more terrifyingly they swung east, behind the entire German 7th Army, aiming for Le Mans and Argentan. This was the moment of total chaos, the nightmare scenario for the German High Command. And it was at this precise moment that the elite divisions of the 15th Army, finally and frantically released from Pas-de-Calais, began to arrive on the collapsing front. General Oberst Hans von Salmuth, the 15th Army's commander, had been ordered to give up his best formations, like the 116th Panzer Division. But they were arriving 7 weeks too late, exhausted from jabo attacks, and into a battle that was already lost. The German commander in the west, General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge, who had replaced von Rundstedt, saw the reality. He knew the only sane order was a full retreat to the Seine. But Adolf Hitler, in a final disastrous consequence of his obsession with the map, saw an opportunity. He saw Patton's armored spearhead as overextended. On August 2nd, he sent a categorical directive to von Kluge, ordering an immediate counterattack between Mortain and Avranches. This was Operation Lüttich. Hitler ordered the newly arrived Panzers, including the 116th and 2nd SS, not to retreat, but to attack times west asterisk, to cut through the U.S. 30th Infantry Division, recapture Avranches and turn the corner, trapping Patton's Third Army. It was a suicidal order. Von Kluge warned it had no chance of success, but Hitler was immovable. On the night of August 6th, the attack began. It failed almost instantly. Allied Ultra, having decrypted the Lüttich orders, was waiting. The U.S. 30th Infantry, in one of the great small unit stands of the war, held its ground at Mortain. When the morning fog lifted, the RAF and U.S. 9th Air Force descended on the concentrated German armor. The attack stalled, and in doing so, sealed the fate of the entire German army in France. By attacking west, Hitler had driven his last armored reserves deeper into the Allied pocket, just as the Canadians and Poles were driving south from Falaise, and the Americans were driving north from Argentan, to close the trap. What followed was the Falaise Pocket, one of the most horrific killing grounds of the war. The 7th Army and the newly arrived elements of the 15th Army were now completely encircled. Their only escape was a narrow gap, a few miles wide, near the village of Chambois. This gap became known to its survivors as the Times Todeskorridor asterisk, the corridor of death. It was a scene of apocalyptic destruction. The Allies, controlling the high ground, poured a merciless, non-stop torrent of artillery, over 100,000 shells into the pocket. Above, Jabo fighter bombers, flying in relays, roamed at will, bombing and strafing anything that moved. German survivors described a landscape from hell. Men, tanks, trucks, and the thousands of horses required for German transport were all torn apart in an indistinguishable mass of wreckage and flesh. The air was thick with the stench of death and burning fuel. This was the final, brutal industrial hammer of the FUSAG lie. The statistical cost was the total destruction of German Army Group B. When the pocket was finally sealed on August 21st, The German army in France had ceased to exist. In the pocket, the Allies captured over 50,000 German soldiers. Another 10,000 were killed, their bodies left to rot in the corridor of death. The material losses were absolute. The Germans abandoned nearly every piece of heavy equipment, hundreds of tanks and assault guns, including the precious Panzers of the 116th Division, along with over 2,000 artillery pieces and 7,000 other vehicles, were left as a twisted metal graveyard. The 15th Army, the force so meticulously preserved to fight a phantom army at Calais, had been released from its post just in time to be fed into the meat grinder of the Falaise pocket and annihilated with the 7th. The lie was exposed, but its work was done. The road to Paris was open. The Battle of Normandy ended in the corridor of death, but the war for France was won in the last week of August. 1944. The liberation of Paris on August 25th was the symbolic end, but the reality was a headlong race. The Allied armies, led by Patton's rampaging Third Army, were advancing so fast they were outrunning their supply lines. The German Wehrmacht in the West had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. This victory was not just a failure of German arms, it was a total, catastrophic, and decisive failure of German intelligence. It was the final victory of the Ghost Army. In the war's aftermath, Allied interrogators were desperate to understand one thing. Why? Why did the German High Command cling to the Pas-de-Calais lie for so long? The post-mortems of the captured German generals are a testament to the deception's perfection. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, the old-school C and C West, stated in his interrogations that the logic of Calais was simply too powerful. He believed it was the shortest crossing, the best port, and the most direct route to Germany. Normandy, he had insisted, was a diversion. The FUSAG deception did not times create times this belief. It merely fed it, confirmed it, and reinforced it with what appeared to be overwhelming proof. General Oberst Hans von Salmuth, the commander of the 15th Army, was even more direct. He stated in his post-war trial that his army was held in readiness for the main invasion at Calais. He confirmed that Hitler and OKW clung to the mistaken belief that the Normandy landings were merely a diversion and that the main attack was still to come at the Pas-de-Calais. He, the man with the Panzers, was forced to wait for an army that never was. On the Allied side, the architects of the lie were almost in disbelief at their own success. The London Controlling Section, led by Colonel John Bevan, had drafted the master script, but its effectiveness had exceeded their wildest dreams. The Double Cross Committee, which ran Agent Garbo, had post-war confirmation of their complete control over the German intelligence service. Captured German records showed that Garbo's reports were not just read, they were revered, forwarded directly to OKW, and used by men like von Roenne as the primary source for their own assessments. The greatest symbol of this success was the fact that on July 29, 1944 weeks times after times D-Day, and in the midst of the Normandy stalemate, the German High Command had awarded their most valuable agent, Garbo, the Iron Cross for his magnificent services to the Reich. The man who had ensured their defeat was decorated by Hitler for his efforts. The final tally of the deception is an industrial one. The lie, FUSAG, held the 19 divisions of the German 15th Army, over 200,000 men, and hundreds of its best Panzer tanks, in a state of paralysis, 150 miles from the decisive battlefield. It held them there for 7 critical weeks. For 50 days, this, Germany's only strategic reserve, was rendered useless. This strategic misallocation was the single decisive factor in the Battle of Normandy. It allowed the Allies to survive the fragile D-Day landings. It allowed them to endure the horrific, failing battle of attrition in the Times Bocage asterisk. And, most importantly, it allowed them to mass the industrial might required for Operation Cobra, the breakout that shattered the 7th Army. By the time the 15th Army was finally released, it was not to fight a battle, but to be fed into the meat grinder of the Falaise pocket. We return, in the end, to the cold darkness of Pas-de-Calais in early June 1944. We returned to the German soldiers huddled behind their massive concrete batteries, staring at the empty sea, waiting. They were waiting for the greatest invasion force in history. But that force, Patton's Ghost Army, was nothing more than an idea. It was rubber tanks, phantom radio signals, and the brilliant, intricate lies of a failed Spanish chicken farmer. This was the ultimate lesson of Operation Fortitude, and the thesis of the entire campaign. The battle for Normandy was not won by steel alone. It was won by imagination. It was a victory of psychology over logistics, secured because the Allies didn't just invent a new reality, they found a fatal assumption in the mind of the enemy and confirmed it.